everybody? Good. Welcome to the online audience as well. When you guys come in, just come to the front. We want to see you.
Yes. So we're Ryan and Kayla North. We won't do much more of introduction beyond that. We have done this training with churches all over the country, a little over 300 of them now. And so what we're going to do today is going to be divided into two equal parts, roughly. The first part we're going to talk about really the hill we're climbing right now. And then number two, we're going to talk about what we can do about that. So the content here today comes from about a 3-hour training. And so we're not doing all of it squeezed into 3 hours because that would be really silly. But what we do is that every single slide will have a QR code on the bottom corner over there. So if you want more information or if you want just to like book a call with us and to talk a little bit more about this type of content, please feel free to do that. And then at the end, also, we'll put an email address up there. So if you want a copy of the slide deck, we'll be happy to send it to you then as well.
So for many years, we ran an adoption and foster care ministry at a local church. And I remember this one support group. We had a support group that met during our evening service. And so all the kids would go into the normal, evening children's ministry programming. And one of the things that, as we're sitting in the class, I noticed this one mom, and she looks at her phone, and she kind of gets that look of defeat on her face, and you're thinking, uh-oh, what's going on? And she gathers up all of her things, and she walks out of the room where we're meeting. And so I said to him, I'm going to follow her and see what's going on. And so I walk out of the room, and I said, hey, what's going on? And she goes, I just got another text that I got to go get my kid. He's having a meltdown, and they want me to come pick him up. And I said, I'm so sorry. And she goes, yeah, I don't think I can come back anymore. Every time I come, this is what happens. And I just always get called out because they can't handle his behavior. Now, this was not someone who attended our church. This was somebody who just came to the church for this specific ministry, trying to find support. She was a single mom. And I was like, I said, let me walk with you to go get him. So I walked with her to go and get this kiddo. And I knew the teacher because my kids were regular attenders in that class. And I said, hey, tell me what was happening. What was going on? And she said, he was playing with a little car, and I told him it was time for us to move into the large group area, and he needed to put it back in the bin with the toys. And he said, no, he didn't want to. And I told him, no, it's time to stop playing toys. And I got a little firmer, and I told him he had to do it. And she said he proceeded to dump over that bucket of toys and then go and dump all the buckets of toys on the ground, right? Any of you that are adoptive and foster parents have likely had that experience at some point or another. It's like something very simple, and it just escalates. It turns into something so much bigger. And so I thought to myself, I was like, man, I could give them a few little tools that could help de-escalate that situation before it got to the point of having to call mom. But at that point, we'd never really thought about doing that. And so we began to formulate, how would we train people? We don't want our church staff and the volunteer staff to go through excessive amounts of training to be able to handle the kids who've experienced trauma. But we know that foster and adopted kids in the room are not the only ones who've experienced trauma. There are likely other kids that would benefit from understanding how to de-escalate situations, how to understand what's happening and what these kids are going through. And so we decided we're going to come up with some sort of a training. So we came up with this training, and we were doing this training in Seattle a few years back. And that morning we were getting ready, and I normally am the one, he's waiting for me as I'm trying to finish getting ready. But for whatever reason, that morning he was still getting ready, and I was done. And so I sat down on the bed in the hotel room, and I'm scrolling through my social media, right? And there's this one particular Facebook group that I'm a part of. And in that group, someone asked this question. Has anyone here found it hard to find a church that fits all of your children's needs? Does such a place even exist? Or am I looking for a unicorn? And when I started reading the comments, I got a little teary-eyed. I was a little sad because I didn't hear people going, oh, come to my church, or our church does this, or we have this. But instead, what I heard was this. As committed Christians previously involved in years of ministry, it's been so difficult, not just for our kids, but for us too. We've had a hard time with this also. Our church is the one I grew up in. We tried looking for other churches before and have not found any we like. We left our church that had been a very important part of our lives for 14 years. It still hurts, but our son was not ever going to be accepted there. We stopped going to church. And these are just a handful of the comments that we pulled from there just as an example of what families were dealing with, trying to find a church that could meet the needs of their kids who'd experienced trauma and had some big behavioral struggles. Because nobody was willing. Everybody was like, oh, you cuss like a sailor, you can't come to youth group. Oh, I'm sorry, you have tantrums, well, mom's just gonna have to come pick you up every time that happens. And over again, we saw people who were like, I just stopped going to church. I just can't find anything that works for our family, so I guess for this season, we just can't go to church. I don't know what else to do, but it's not working. I'm only being stressed out having to go and get my kids every single week.
We're almost a data-obsessed culture, and so the good news to that is if you want information about anything, somebody has surveyed some group of Americans and can provide data on that. One of the things we love surveying every year in the United States is religion and people's religious affiliations and how they view religion and its importance in their lives. And so the 2023 Gallup Religious Survey said that 45% of Americans say that religion is very important in their life, with another 26% saying it's fairly important, and 28% saying it's not very important. When Gallup first asked this question in 1965, 70% said that religion was very important. So you may go, yeah, I guess. I mean, from 1965 to what was 1965? 80 years ago? No, I don't know. 60 years ago?
Don't make me do the math.
I should have done the math. 60 years ago. You may go, yeah, that makes sense. The culture's changed, times have changed. But when you look at that as a number of people, 70% of the population of 1965 is much smaller than 45% of the population in 2024. The other thing that's worthy of note there is the word religion is on that slide, not Christianity. Because we're in a Christian church and most of us are Christian people listening to this, we automatically, our brain just put the word Christianity in there. That is all religions across the board in the United States. Only 45% of Americans today say that religion is important. But I think that is a misleading statistic because they asked the second question. The second question says, when describing the behavior more generally, 21% of Americans report that attended religion services every week. So I would suggest to you that the actual percentage of Americans that think religion is important is 21%. Because they thought it was important enough to go. Now, you may go, that's actually pretty bleak. Why are you doing this to us? You need to be encouraging us. But the truth of the matter is, it's not that bleak because that 21% of Americans who attend religion means that the size of your opportunity is 79% of the population. Your opportunity is 79% of the population. For those of you who like charts and graphs, as I do, this is merely just a visual representation of the Gallup numbers. Now look how that trend has gone down over time, the green number. The other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the dotted red number, which is the increasing number of Americans who have said that religion is not important. That is the cathedral at Rouen in France. For those of you who don't know where Rouen is, it is a former medieval city in the north of France. It is today part of the Paris metropolitan area. But what you'll notice is that cathedral is the largest, most impressive building in that city, and medieval cities were built around the church. Geographically, the church was at the center of your community. All civic life rotated around the church. How many of you have been to Denton, Texas? What's in the middle of the square? The courthouse. Because we have put the law in the center of our communities and put Christianity, religion, whatever you want to say for the purposes of the illustration, on the sidelines. We think that the numbers suggest a great opportunity for us as a church to put the church back at the center of our communities culturally. It presents a great opportunity for us to put this church back in the center of our communities culturally. And that's what we're interested in when we're training churches and helping them to understand the value of the content that we're going to give you just a little bit of this afternoon. This, again, because if you love charts and graphs as much as I do, This one is now to looking at the importance of religion by generation. So you'll notice that the orange number actually grows as we get from the silent generation up to Gen Z. We'll notice that the important number also diminishes. So we don't have to do the math on there because I summarized it. I did the math for you because that's how nice I am. There we go. So the importance of religion. 58% of all Americans across the board say that religion is important. Number 2, baby boomers. 62% of baby boomers say that religion is important. Gen X. How many of you Gen X in here? The best. 54%. Millennials, 42%. Say that religion's very important. These are really important numbers because you're going, that's diminishing over time. What is important to notice is that the majority of people who have kids in your children's ministry, only 42% of those people think that church is important. Now, how can we turn that ship around? That's a great question. Now, I'm not going to get into the reasons because, as you might imagine, this data actually has a lot more to it, and they start asking people who say the church isn't important, why is it not important? And if you want to go down the rabbit hole into Wonderland, Google some of these things, and you'll find your answers. Some of the answers are really convicting, and some of the answers are really condemning. They don't think church is important because increasingly more, the younger generation of people with small children who are of age to go to your children's ministry think that the church is not a place where they find hope, where they find healing, where they find answers. They don't think of the church that way anymore because it used to be at the center of our lives. Now it's on the fringes. One of the ways that we can change the way we think about that is through children's ministry. Now you may be going, okay, that sounds great. Anybody can say that. Also, we don't like this importance of religion stuff because that includes non-Christian faiths. Okay, we'll move on from that. We'll move to the Barna group, who does almost exclusively their surveys are conducted with Christian folk. Right, now in order to be part of the survey, you had to answer these 3 questions in the affirmative. Question number 1, do you attend at least one religious service at your place of worship? So if you came on a Saturday night, a Sunday morning, some kind of midweek thing, any of that would qualify you. Number 2, do you read your Bible at least one time a week outside of said church service? Number 3, do you pray at least once a week outside of church service? This group is called engaged Christian parents. Now, if the bar is go to church once, read your Bible once, say one prayer, I think we can all agree that the bar was pretty low. From that group, 58% of them said the primary factor that they considered when determining church attendance, meaning whether they decided to go to a church, whether they decided to stay at a church, or whether they decided to leave a church, the number one factor for 58% of them was how their children were treated at children's ministry. How many in here volunteer in children's ministry or work in children's ministry? Okay, I have good news and bad news. You're the ball game. So much of the health of the church in our country is dependent on what happens in children's ministry now. The data is overwhelming. If you ignore it, it's because you've chosen to ignore it. That's why we have to make children's ministry a place where children feel safe, welcome, and loved.
So we firmly believe that children heal where they feel safe, right? And we know that churches have done lots of things to make sure that background checked people are coming in and nobody gets in with our kids. Physical safety. We've done a lot to make sure that kids are physically safe when they come into our churches, right? We put up all sorts of measures in place to make sure they're not going home with the wrong people and that they're not being hurt while they're at church. But the reality is we're not talking about physical safety. We're talking about emotional safety. We're talking about feeling safe with the adults, that they're going to care for them, that they're going to have their best interest at heart. And when we're talking about kids who've already been harmed, who've already experienced trauma, they have a heightened sense of alert, and they are really worried that when they go in that room, that they're not going to feel safe. And you don't always know when kids enter your church whether or not they have experienced some kind of a trauma. So I remember when our oldest son, when he first moved in with us, we went to a pretty big church and we had a baby, and then we brought home a 4-year-old. And so a couple weeks after he came, we decided we were going to try him in children's ministry. We were going to try putting him in children's ministry just to see how he did. The problem is nobody in the 4-year-olds class knew who we were because we'd only been in the infants because we had a baby. And so we show up, they don't know us from anybody else, and we show up with a 4-year-old who looks just like us. And we say, hey, here's our son, we're gonna bring him into your classroom. And he starts clinging to us and he freezes up and he he's not going in. There is no way you're making this kid go in that classroom. And they're like, it's okay, he'll be fine, right? Because they don't know what he's experienced. They don't know he's only lived in my home for 2 weeks. And he is terrified that I'm not gonna come back and pick him up. And so me leaving him has triggered him we're like, it's okay, we'll take him with us, it's fine. I'm not gonna traumatize him more by leaving him in the classroom. But they all look at us like, it's gonna be fine, everything's fine, we're safe. But he doesn't know that. So we've made it our goal to make sure that we are helping adults create places where kids feel safe, welcome, and loved. That's what we want. We want all of the adults to know how to keep their spaces, every space we're in, whether it be in churches, in homes, in ministry settings, wherever. We want kids to feel safe, and adults need to figure out how to do this. So a lot of times people come to us, and they're not looking for how do I help kids feel safe. They want to know, we've got this kid who has this behavior, and how do I make it stop? That's the majority of why people come to us. They don't come to us and say, how do I make this kid feel safe here? They come and they say, this kid is doing this behavior and it's not acceptable and I have to figure out a way to make it stop because I'm getting complaints from parents, blah, 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 whatever. They come to us and that's what they want. And we said, you can't start at the end. You have to start at the beginning. You have to go back and help this child feel safe. They have to know they can trust you. They have to know that you are someone who has their best interest at heart. When they begin to feel safe, they will build relationships with you. And out of those relationships, you will see behavioral changes. Our goal is not necessarily behavioral changes. Our goal is relationship. But everybody wants the behaviors to change. And so we have to back up and say, yes, we want behaviors to change, but we want them to change because out of relationship, these kids feel safe and they feel like, I can listen to you. You have my best interest at heart. You're not going to hurt me. You're not going to leave me. You're not going to do something that's, makes me feel unsafe, right? They have that relationship with you and they know that.
I'm assuming that most of us in Texas, at least maybe the audience out there is familiar with Dr. Brene Brown. She's pretty impressive. She's simultaneously a professor at the University of Houston and the University of Texas, so that seems like an impressive trick. How many of you have seen her TED Talk? Okay, so for those of you who did not raise your hands, the first one she did, if you watch it, it's good, but I have to warn you that Dr. Brown is a native Texan, so she likes guns, cowboy boots, and cussing. And I'm assuming that that's probably 2 of those 3 aren't a problem for most of us in the room over here. So if you watch it, please know that she might cuss a little bit, and if that bothers you, or if you don't want your kids to hear that, you have been warned. But Dr. Brown says that compassion is a deeply held belief, and empathy is the skill set needed to bring compassion alive. Now, I love that, so here's the different dictionary definition of compassion. Compassion is a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. Now, I love the comparison there between sympathy and empathy, right? Sympathy is a feeling. I think sympathy is an important emotion in much the same way that if I am driving from here to Houston, the on-ramp is pretty important to get me on my journey. But that's all it is. It's just an on-ramp. I'll give you an example. A child's placed in your home at 11:30 one night, because everybody who's ever been a foster parent knows that children are only placed after 11 p.m. in the evening. And one of these children's placed in your home, and the caseworker comes and gives you some of the information, some context. You look at the case files. You somehow magically and amazingly get this child to actually fall asleep at night one in your house. And thanks for laughing, because it doesn't happen, right? And so then you're laying in bed there with your spouse, and you go, oh my gosh, we have to do whatever we can to help Johnny. I just feel so sorry for him. Which is a great place to start. But here's the problem with just having sympathy, is that 2 days later, when Johnny smashes something your granny gave you as a wedding present and he's peeing on the wall, ain't nobody feeling sorry for Johnny at your house. But if you choose ahead of time to have compassion for Johnny and his experiences, to see the world through his eyes, and to try to understand his experience, your response to him will be different. Which is why I love this quote of hers. I also love the dictionary definition of compassion, because it says at the end, when you do something to alleviate the person's suffering. When you look at Jesus in the New Testament, every single time the word compassion is used, you're likely going to find an action after that. You cannot be a compassionate person who does nothing. If you're a compassionate person who does nothing, you are just a person who talks about being compassionate. The Bible says, and Jesus saw the crowd and he had compassion on them, so he taught them. He had compassion on them, he fed them. He saw the blind man and he had compassion on him, so he restored his sight. And then in Luke chapter 4, when the procession of the widow's in this funeral procession of her son. So we know that she doesn't have a husband because she's a widow, and now we know her only son has died. And if you know anything about how the world worked 2,000 years ago, any woman without a male covering in the society was on her own. She would likely have to survive on the kindness of others to make it. She could not own any property. She couldn't do anything like that. And she is wailing because it's not just that she's mourning the loss of her son. She's essentially mourning the loss of her life. And Jesus has compassion on her. And he raises the boy back to life because of his great compassion for this woman. It's in order to be a compassionate person, you have to be a person of action. All right.
All right, so let's talk about what is trauma. What does trauma look like? A lot of times when people say trauma, they think abuse and neglect. I apologize, I had bronchitis a couple weeks ago, and that cough that lingers and lingers and lingers. It's still here.
You want me to do it?
Oh, I can catch my breath there. Okay. So when we talk about trauma, what are we talking about? We're not just talking about abuse and neglect. We're also talking about some other factors. So these are some risk factors that we're talking about when we talk trauma. And again, you may not know the stories of every kid that comes in to your church. Every kid who's in your classroom, you may not know those stories. And so as a result, you may not know what some of these are. So first is stress and harm. I am so sorry. I've been good all day, and then we get here, right? Stress and harm during pregnancy. So we're talking, kids who have experienced malnutrition in utero, kids who've been exposed to drugs and alcohol, but also moms that are just really stressed, working high-stress jobs. That can count as stress in utero because the baby feels everything that the mom feels. Babies come out stressed if moms are stressed, right? So we have 6 children. 2 of our children are biological. And our first biological daughter, the pregnancy with her was very stressful. It was very complicated in that pregnancy. And then when she was born, I didn't see her for about 5 or 6 hours after she was born because they whisked her off to the NICU because she had some struggles at birth, right? That is early medical trauma, complications during delivery, right? We had all of that. And this was our biological daughter. This is our biological daughter that meets some of these risk factors. We also had one of our kiddos that we adopted, and she was placed in our arms. She was 5 pounds, but she'd been born as a micro preemie. She'd been in the hospital for 4 months already. And so we know that babies are intended to be placed into the loving arms of their mom. They're intended to be adored, right? They're loved, right? We're bathing them with sensory input. We're rocking them. We're cuddling them. We're there to meet their cries. She'd been in the NICU for 4 months with nobody doing that for her.
She'd be in the NICU for 4 months with nobody doing that for her. And then from being in the NICU for 4 months, she also had multiple surgeries in those 4 months as well. And so instead of the safe, loving touch, the way God intended it, she was getting poked, prodded, surgical steel. I don't know if you've ever been in an operating room or a NICU, but both of those things are very, very cold. Okay, this is called complex development. This is from the complex developmental trauma checklist because what we safely can assume, because we already know that you rarely, if ever, have one of these risk factors. Right? Stress and harm during pregnancy invariably raises the likelihood of harm, of a difficult delivery, of complications during delivery, and complications in delivery will lead to early medical trauma, extra surgeries, medical interventions to preserve the child's life, and time in the NICU as well. Then the next ones on the list are abuse and neglect. Those are ones that are synonymous with foster care because, you can have, you make a call to the abuse and neglect hotline, and that's the way that children often enter into the child welfare system. But we all know that you don't have to be in foster care to have been a victim of abuse or neglect. And much more so now, with the definition of neglect having changed in Texas in recent times. And so when we talk about abuse and neglect, we want to focus on three things there: abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Those three things being different. And then when we talk about neglect, we talk about physical neglect and emotional neglect. The truth of the matter is, whenever you hear about abuse or neglect on the media, if you see it on a news story, it's typically physical abuse or physical neglect. Right? You've all likely heard a story of a child that wasn't fed, was locked in a dog's kennel, or was locked in a closet. You've likely heard some version of one of those stories on the news, but you've never, ever heard a story of a child who was emotionally neglected. Because here's the truth of the matter. We focus on the part that gets into foster care, but I promise you that every time a child tries to speak to an adult and they don't look up from this thing, the child learned in that moment that this thing was more important than the child. We have to be very, very careful, which is why initially our inroads, for lack of a better term, into churches was through adoption and foster care ministry, because they wanted to talk about abuse and neglect and other kinds of trauma. But the truth of the matter is that you don't have to touch or go anywhere near the child welfare system for these things to be very, very real. Right? And then we have other trauma. That's typically what we think of as non-medical trauma, meaning a natural disaster, maybe. You live through a hurricane, that's pretty traumatic. Or divorce. We could put divorce in there. The data on divorce is not good, knowing that the divorce rates inside and outside the church are pretty similar. The divorce rates are getting lower by generation. Do you know this? The divorce rates are getting lower by generation because smaller percentages of younger generations are getting married. Right? So that's the way we solve the divorce problem. We just didn't get married. And then systemic trauma. This is specific to adoption and foster care. For those of you who have no foster care experience, I'm going to give you the 30-second version of how foster care works. Something goes, after a long period of time, something actually goes really bad at the house. The police are called. A caseworker and a police officer show up. A child is taken from, even though it's an unsafe environment, they're an environment the child's known, put in the car with complete strangers, compounded by the fact that one of those complete strangers has a gun and a uniform, and their belongings are put into a black trash bag. And as I've already pointed out, this only ever happens after 11 p.m. every single time that it happens. They show up at your house at midnight. You sit, there's a flurry of activity because you've got to sign a bunch of papers to make the placement official. And then they leave, and this child is with complete strangers. Now, you might be the best person who's walked the planet since Jesus did, but you're just somebody the kid doesn't know, right? That's a really traumatic experience for the child. And then what happens is that foster home is either not equipped enough or supported well enough or some combination of the two of those things, and they call the agents to say, we're really struggling with Johnny's behavior, he got to go. And that's compounding, because what the child learned is that another person gave up on me. Okay, that's what we mean by that systemic trauma. Now, we have good news. The good news is there's not a lot of things impacted by traumatic experiences, adverse experiences, lived experiences, whatever you want to say.
But if you look at that list, you realize that that's the entirety of a person, right? Their brain is impacted, their body, their biology, Their belief systems are impacted. That's really important. Their behaviors are impacted by trauma, and bonding. It's just the way they attach to their caregivers has been impacted by the trauma that they've experienced, right? And so at first we would be like, yeah, there's not a lot of areas that are impacted, right? It's a really short list. But then you look at it and you go, it's actually the entirety of the person. We have to recognize that when someone experiences trauma, they are impacted on a deep, deep level. It's not just we remove them from the situation they were in and now things are better, right? They weren't getting fed here, now they're getting fed here, everything's better. We have a 16-year-old son who has been in our home since he was 4 years old, and still, when there's a plate of something he loves, he's like, oh, I must have the biggest piece. I must have the most amount, and it does not matter. It's like he loses sight of every other person in the room when there is something that he loves because he is so afraid he's not going to get as much as he wants of it. And that stems from early childhood. That stems from those first few years. He has had as much as he has needed since he was 4, but we still experience those symptoms of trauma because they are deep rooted, and especially when they happen in those early years.
Oh, we're a little old school in our house, and by that I mean that of the 8 people who live there, 3 of us are boys and 5 of us are girls, and the boys always let the ladies get their dinner first. Okay, that's one of the things we do in the house. Every single meal in my house, I have to remind him to let his mom and his sisters get food first. I have to remind him that yesterday when he let them get food first, he still ate as much as he wanted, but I'm always treated to this. Oh, this is stupid. Because your childhood experiences are really, really impactful. The truth of the matter is, and by the way, since I walked in here, I've been waiting for this moment. Here we go. The truth of the matter is that this list, brain should be a bullet point and everything else should be indented, because the fact that your brain is impacted by trauma and your experiences is what makes those other things impacted. This is from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child. This is a great resource for understanding brain development, just brain development in general. Kayla, can you step down the stairs for a second?
Yes.
If she moves, can you guys see a little bit better? Okay. So what I want to talk about is, you see where these 2 lines intersect here around about 30 years of age. Let's just accept that that's when Harvard research says your brain's fully developed. Okay? And so this blue line is the brain's ability to change in response to experiences. The orange line is the amount of effort such change requires. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is that negative experiences in childhood are very, very impactful. Right? See how steep that line is? Think about how children learn language. They learn how to speak because they hear you speak to them. You don't show apple. This is an apple. Say apple. Nobody does that. You go, do you want some apple? And the kid, because of the brains in association making machine, goes, that must be an apple. Right? We pick up language that easily. How many of you are over the age of 40 in this room? Have you tried to learn a language since your 40th birthday? It was hard. Right? I've deleted Duolingo so much that now when I try to download it, Apple just says, you can't download it. We know you're not serious. That's like the message I get from the App Store. But here's the good news. Those childhood experiences, this is a bigger stage than I thought. Those childhood experiences, positive, negative, and positive, look at all of this fertile land over here between the orange and the blue lines. That means that you can change the trajectory of a child's life in your ministry based on how you treat them every Sunday morning. I wish I had a witness in this room, because that feels like good news to me today. You can change the trajectory of a child's life based on how you treat them in your children's ministry, because it's so positively impactful just because of the age they are and the way their brains develop.
So we're talking about brains, okay? Everybody hold your hand up like this, fold your thumb in, and then put your fingers down over the top. If you haven't seen this before, this is called the handy model of the brain. It's a very simplified way of showing you how the brain works, and especially when it comes to some of the experiences that we have with children. So this part of the brain is the thinking part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that makes decisions, that you can reason with, you can have conversations. It's where language is. This part of the brain is fully developed at 30. So that means if we're talking about children, it's not even fully developed, But when it's online, we can have conversations, we can talk to our kids about different things, we can explain situations to them, right? But you would explain things differently to a 4-year-old than you might to a 14-year-old. But when you're born, this downstairs part of your brain, this is the part that has to do with things like breathing. This is the part of the brain that has to do with things like your heart beating and all of your internal bodily functions. That all has to be online when you're born, right? You have to be able to do those things. But also, this is where fear responses live. This is where, when things are scary, when I don't feel safe, this is the part of the brain that's in control. Notice the thinking part of the brain is not in control. This part of the brain is in control. So if you've ever had a kid, let's just say, when we were first parenting, and we would tell our kids, don't run through the house, you're gonna fall and hurt yourself. But of course they didn't listen. They still ran through the house, and they would fall and hurt themselves. And we would say, just like great parents, we would say, see, I told you, if you run through the house, you're gonna fall and hurt yourself, because we thought teachable moment. And then we learned this, and we realized the thinking part of their brain's not online. All they heard in that moment was mean mom. You don't care about me. Because in that moment, what they really needed was this. Let's go to that next slide. What they really needed was this. They were in the downstairs part of their brain. We needed to talk to the downstairs part of their brain. We needed to meet them where they were and say, I'm so sorry you got hurt. I'm so sorry you skinned your knee. Can I get you a Band-Aid? Come sit by me. I'm so sorry, baby. They're crying, they're all upset, and we meet them where they are. We regulate them. We say, I'm so sorry. Let me get you something that you need. And then we relate to them. We're like, oh, I really don't like it when I fall and hurt either. Man, that must really hurt. We relate to them where they are. And as this is happening, what's happening is this part of their brain is re-engaging, and ultimately we can talk to this part of their brain, and we can reason with them, and we can say, man, do you remember when we talked about not running through the house? I really didn't want you to get hurt like you just did. So if we just remember not to run through the house, then we won't fall and hurt ourselves. The problem is, this part of their brain's not fully developed, which means they're still gonna do this 47 times. They're still gonna run through the house, and we're gonna repeatedly meet them where they are. We're gonna regulate them. We're gonna relate to them. Then we're gonna teach them. And over time, as their brain grows and matures, they're going to remember, when I'm in distress, mom and dad care for me. When I'm in distress, my Sunday school teacher loves me and cares for me. When I'm in distress, adults can be trusted to meet my needs, and I'm gonna go to them when I have big stuff. Because I promise you, it gets bigger as they get older. The stuff gets bigger, right? The things that, it's not falling and skinning their knee. It's making a really stupid decision that they shouldn't have done. And they still need us to meet them where they are and say, I'm so sorry. That's really hard. I've made some really bad decisions in my life too. And then when they're regulated, then we can try and teach them a lesson or talk to them and reason with them from this part of their brain.
This is a great slide. If you haven't taken a picture of it and written down regulate, relate, and reason, you need to, because you can do this tomorrow morning with the kids in ministry. Because it might not be running in the house. It might be throwing a car. It might be, heaven forbid, peeling the cotton ball off the sheep that somebody else glued on the piece of paper. Or as I like to call it, the receipt from children's ministry.
You're not allowed to make me laugh, because when you make me laugh, I start coughing, so don't do that.
I'd like to apologize to everybody. So you can do this right away. You can implement this tomorrow, because all it communicates is, I see you, I hear you, I care about you, and you're more important. Making sure that you're okay is more important to me than making sure you do what I say. Oh, I like the way that rhymed. I'm going to use that again. Please remember our equation from earlier, where people feel safe, they can build relationships and behaviors change. That used to say, where people feel safe, they can build relationships and lives are healed. But parents used to say, we're more focused on relationships right now, on behaviors right now, and so we just changed it to behaviors, and everybody liked the slide more. And so remember that, but the central part of that is relationships, because relationships matter. Now, I'm going to put a quote up here. It's from a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Dr. Bruce Perry. Read, listen to everything Perry wrote. It's only 3 books, so you'll be fine. Okay, you're going to be fine. This is from the boy who was raised as a dog. Dr. Perry said, the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. This man, in case you don't know who Dr. Perry is, has done more to help the world understand traumatized people, their experiences, and how we can help them than almost anybody else in the course of human history. Millions of people's lives are better because this man walks the face of the earth. If you're wondering what I mean by that, every single time there is a big crisis involving children, the federal government of the United States only calls one person, this man. Branch Davidians, Columbine, El Dorado, you name it, he leads the clinical team to help work with those children who've experienced those enormous traumas. And he said that relationships are the agents of change. And the most powerful therapy is human love, which is pretty cool because that's what Paul said 2,000 years ago. Now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is, right? The Bible talks about the supremacy of love. And I don't mean I love coffee, I mean I choose to act in your best interest. Okay, so we want to leave you with, in the last few minutes we have here, with these 5 practical tools. When we do either the video-based training is 3 hours, or we'll do a whole day training with churches with small components. We unpack these in much greater detail, but we're just going to give you the 45-second tour of each of these so you can walk out of here with something you can do in children's ministry tomorrow morning, or if tonight. And if you're working in children's ministry tonight, may the Lord bless you and keep you, because this is going to be a long day. Anybody working tonight? Okay, smart. That's smart.
All right, so the first one is the joy of saying yes. The thing that is such an easy tool, and when I learned this, I was like, whatever, I say yes all the time. And then I started paying attention, and I was like, I do not say yes all the time. I say no all the time. Can I do this? No. Can I do this? No. Because they ask you 900 questions. So you want to say no all the time because you're trying to keep control. You're trying to make sure that things run smoothly and that the ship keeps going in the forward direction, right? We need to say yes more often, because I don't know about you, but I don't like to be told no. Like if I'm asking somebody to do something or for something, I'm saying, I want a yes. I want you to affirm me in that. And kids are no different. And especially when you're dealing with kids who've experienced trauma, they've heard a lot of no's in their life. They've heard a lot of not right nows. They've had a lot of broken promises. And so when we can pay attention and we can say yes more often, we're going to see things begin to change, because now all of a sudden they're not sneaking to get something. They can come to you and ask you for it, because they recognize that when you can, you're going to say yes. That's what I always tell kids. I'm like, I will say yes as much as I can to you, but I can't always say yes. I might not be able to say yes in this moment, but a lot of times what we say no to is convenience for ourselves. We're like, I'm going to say no to that because I don't want to deal with the mess that's going to come with it. Or I'm going to say no to that because if I say yes to that one kid, I'm going to have to say yes to all the rest of the kids. And that, we don't want to deal with it. It's inconvenient, right? But if it doesn't harm, and if we can do it, the more we can say yes, the better they will be at accepting no when we have to say it.
Besides, how many of you want God to say no to you when you want something from him? None of us. Especially the big things. Will you forgive me for all the wrong I've done? No. Like nobody wants that. Just think about how many times we say no to people who want something from us, but expect people to say yes to us every single time we ask for something. And it's so important in the church that we embrace this privilege, because it communicates right away that you matter, and I will listen to you. The second one on the list over here is get them moving. Churches are pretty good about this one, because at some point in the morning, we all line up and we go to the big room for large group. But when we unpack this a little bit more, we want to understand that kids who've experienced trauma because of anything that's compromised neurologically with those kids, there's higher instances of sensory processing disorders and higher instances of sensory uniquenesses. And so we want to make sure that's great. Get them moving. That's awesome. It's really good for them. Kids were not designed to sit still and behave for an hour, okay? They were not. So you have to understand that. But in those, let's make sure we got the $5 shooting earmuffs from Walmart or whatever we have to make sure that they're able to cope in that environment even while we're getting them moving.
And I'm going to combo these next two because I think they really go well together. When we're talking about kids, especially that have experienced trauma, but all kids like to be in charge. Like a lot of kids just want to be in charge. And especially when they feel like things are out of control or when they don't feel safe. Because even a little 5-year-old can be like, well, nobody else is going to protect me, so I got to protect myself. I got to be in charge here. And what happens with us as adults is when we're in charge and kids try and take charge, our inclination, our immediate response is to say, oh, no, no, no. I am the boss here. You will listen to me, and we get firmer, we get into these battles, right? Like if you've never gotten into a battle with a little kid, good for you. Because most people have gotten into a battle and gotten headlocked in this battle trying to over dumb stuff most of the time. Most of the time it's not important, it's little things. And we get into these battles of control. And the reality is if you have to get into a battle to try and get a kid to believe you're in charge, you're not actually in charge. So when we're actually in charge, what we can do is we can say, I'm going to offer you a little bit of control in the situation so that you feel like you're in charge of this moment while still regaining my in chargeness, right? So I'm going to say, you have this choice or you have this choice. And I know what you're all thinking because you're like, yeah, I'm going to give them two choices and they're going to go, but I actually want this choice. And then you're going to say, wow, thank you for using your words. That was a really good idea. I hadn't even thought about that. Yes, you may have that compromise. And that's the second one, right? Be willing to compromise, right? We don't have to get stuck into, because what most of us do is we say, would you like to do this or do this? And they go, I want to do this. And you say, but that's not the choices I gave you. I said this or this, right? And we want to get stuck in those. But the reality is if we can give them a little bit of voice in the situation, if we can give them a little bit of control in the situation, they're going to stop trying to get all the control everywhere else.
I always think it's a good idea to ask yourself when you're interacting with a child, would I like it if God treated me the way I'm treating this child? Mm-hmm. It's a good question to ask yourself, right? God himself has proven to be willing to compromise. Find the story in the book of Exodus where he wants to wipe the Israelites off the face of the earth, and Moses says, you could do it if you want to, you're God Almighty. But then the other nations will say, you just brought them out of Egypt so you could kill them yourself. And the Bible has some of the best and most comforting words. It says, and then Moses changed the Lord's mind. If God will listen to Moses, then we have the responsibility of at least hearing the kids out and not just coming down harshly on them. Let's try that again. Remember, Kayla talks about how your belief systems were compromised by trauma. Please know that if a child doesn't think that they're valuable and that they're worthy of being loved and of being treated kindly because of the way the adults in their lives have treated them at home, part of what we have to do in children's ministry is to create an environment where they can learn that they are valuable. And we learn that by giving them choices, by being willing to compromise, by saying yes to them. These are really important. These aren't just little tools to keep the train moving, but they're ways that we change the way that children get to think about themselves. Because if they don't believe that they are worthy of good things happening to them because nobody's ever treated them with kindness, I promise you that there's a very small to 0% chance that when you tell them about a God who they cannot see, who loves them and wants what's best for them and wants a relationship with them, that they're going to believe you. Because the things we're talking about, they're not just about how to manage Sunday morning, but they're how to change the environment in your children's ministry so we can create lifelong disciples who follow Jesus and who don't exit the faith when they go off to college. But you remember my brain graph from earlier? That happens in children's ministry. Right? That's not my opinion. The research says that happens in children's ministry based on the way that their brains develop. This one here, let's try that again. Or redos, or as I like to say, grace by another name. Because every morning I'm glad that God looks down from heaven and he goes, you know what, Ryan, you didn't have a great day yesterday, son. But the sun's shining again today. You woke up, and so we have another opportunity for you to get it right. And I'm right here with you, helping you. You didn't hit the mark yesterday, but that's okay. Today's another opportunity to get that right. That's what it means, because in the Bible, redos are just called grace. That's the posture we have to have with the children, because there's few things that we can do on this list that will teach the children that they are valuable and God is a gracious, loving God, than them saying, no, that's not how we do that. Let's try that again. Dare I ask for a witness? I won't.
And then the last one, really quickly, is just managing transitions. For kids who've experienced a lot of turmoil in their life, they've had a lot of transitions. They've moved from home to home, they've moved from place to place. We know a single mom who her 11-year-old daughter's probably lived in 14 or 15 places, sometimes having to move in the middle of the night because they were being evicted and they could just take what they could carry with them before they got into some big trouble, right? So we know that transitions are really, really hard. So moving from one activity to another, we're making sure we're giving warnings and we're allowing them time to transition and not springing it on them. Oh shoot, I didn't pay attention to the time. We gotta go, go, go. We're just gonna be late because we're gonna give them time to move, because otherwise you're gonna have time fixing the meltdown that's happening because we didn't give them time, right?
Okay, and then if you want me to send you a copy of the slides, just send that to that email address. And I will also, if you would like more information about the training for your children's ministry, you can scan that QR code. It'll take you to a page on our website where you can learn more about it, and then you can, reach out to us if you have any more questions. Thank you very much for your time.